She didn't cry. That's the part nobody could explain. In the middle of a Seoul rooftop blazing with champagne lights and 100 witnesses, the man she had loved for 3 years grabbed a microphone and told the world she was nothing. Not a woman, not a partner, a wallet, a convenience, a placeholder until something better came along. And she stood there, chest open, heart bleeding, and did not shed a single tear. She simply set down her glass, straightened her spine, and walked away. What no one in that crowd knew, what even she didn't know, was that the most powerful man in that building had watched every second of it. And he was already moving. Drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit like, stay until the end, and let's begin. The invitation had been Darius's idea. That was the first thing Nyla would remember later, in the quiet hours when sleep refused to come and her mind kept rewinding the night like a damaged reel. He had been the one to suggest they attend the Kang Industries anniversary gala together. He had been the one to pick out her dress, a deep burgundy wrap that he said made her look like royalty. And he had stood behind her in the bathroom mirror while she fixed her earrings and told her she was the most beautiful woman in any room she entered. She had believed him. That was the wound that would take the longest to close. Not the humiliation, not the crowd. The fact that she had believed him. Nyla Brooks was 31 years old and had spent the last 2 years of her life building something she thought was solid. She had a career she had clawed for. Executive assistant to Young Si-won, CEO of Kang Industries, one of the most demanding positions in one of the most demanding companies in Seoul's corporate landscape. She had an apartment she paid for alone, a savings account she had nursed since her early 20s, a routine that kept her moving even on the mornings when movement felt impossible. She was not a woman who relied on anyone for anything she could provide herself. She had learned that lesson early, growing up in Atlanta with a mother who worked double shifts and a father who was generous with promises and useless with follow-through. Darius had seemed different. That was the simplest and most humiliating truth. He was charming in a way that felt specific to her, attentive in a way that disarmed the walls she had spent years constructing, and he had a talent for making her feel chosen, as if out of every option in front of him, he had looked around and decided she was the one worth staying for. 3 years. She had given him 3 years of her life, her money, her patience, and a level of trust that did not come naturally to her. The rooftop of Kang Tower was extraordinary on a normal evening. On the night of the company's 15th anniversary, it was something else entirely. White lights strung across the entire perimeter, tables draped in ivory linen, a live quartet in the far corner playing something that drifted between jazz and classical without fully committing to either. The skyline of Seoul spread out in every direction like a circuit board lit from within, and the air carried that particular quality of a summer night, warm enough to be comfortable, cool enough to remind you that the city was breathing. Nyla had arrived feeling something close to happy. She registered now, in retrospect, how rare that had been. She'd spent 20 minutes at the drinks table with her colleague Priya, who worked in the legal department and had a laugh that could cut glass, and a personality that made Nyla feel less like the only black woman in a room full of people who didn't quite know how to talk to her. They had shared 2 glasses of wine and a mutual distaste for the catering manager who kept hovering over the hors d'oeuvres like a security guard. And by the time Nyla started looking around for Darius, she was relaxed in a way she hadn't been all week. She found him near the east railing, speaking with a group of men she didn't recognize. He glanced at her when she approached, and something moved across his face. Quick, like a door closing. But she had told herself later it was the lighting. She was always making excuses for the things his face did when he didn't know she was watching. "Having fun?" she asked. "Working the room?" he said, without turning fully toward her. "That's what you do at these things." "Right." She stood beside him for a moment that stretched uncomfortably. "Do you want to get a table? They're about to serve dinner." "In a minute." She waited. He kept talking to the men. She eventually moved away because standing next to someone who made you feel invisible required more energy than she had available, and she was not a woman who begged for attention from anyone, not even men she loved. The dinner was good. The speeches were long. The CEO of Kang Industries, Young Si-won, gave a 7-minute address that somehow felt neither too short nor too long, which Nyla knew from 3 years of managing his calendar and correspondence was a deliberate calculation on his part. He was not a man who did anything accidentally. She watched him at the podium, controlled, precise, the kind of quiet authority that didn't announce itself. and felt the specific professional pride of someone who had helped build that image from behind the scenes. Darius sat beside her at the table but spoke mostly to the man on his other side. Nyla ate her salmon, responded when spoken to, and monitored the low hum of discomfort in her chest with the clinical detachment she had developed for exactly these situations. Something was off. She didn't know what. She had learned not to push. It was around the second round of drinks, when the music shifted to something louder, and the formal portion of the evening dissolved into networking and laughter, that Darius disappeared from her side. She didn't panic. She refreshed her drink and found Priya again, and let 20 minutes pass with the comfortable ease of someone who trusted that the man she came with would eventually reappear. She was not the kind of woman who chased. She had decided that about herself long ago. When the microphone feedback cut through the music and brought the rooftop to an uncomfortable attention, she turned with everyone else to see who had commandeered the small stage near the bar. It was Darius. He was holding the microphone with the ease of a man who had been rehearsing this moment, and he was grinning, not at her, but at the crowd, at the lights, at the version of the night he had clearly been building in his head while she had been making conversation and telling herself everything was fine. "Can I have everyone's attention for just 1 second?" His voice carried cleanly. He'd always known how to project. "I've been holding something in all night, and I think it's time to let it out." Nyla felt the first cold thread of something wrong move through her, but she held her expression steady. Maybe this was a toast. Maybe he'd had one too many and was feeling sentimental. She ran through the explanations quickly, the way she always did, building him a defense before she even knew the charge. "First," Darius said, "I want to thank someone, because without her, I literally could not have survived the last 3 years in this city." He paused, and the crowd offered the polite laugh that crowds give when they sense a story coming. "Nyla Brooks. Baby, where are you? Come on, let her through." Heads turned, eyes found her. She felt the weight of the room's attention land on her shoulders like something physical, and she kept her face still. Years of working for Young Siwon had given her that skill, and she didn't move toward the stage. She waited. "There she is," Darius said, pointing, and his voice carried something she couldn't quite name. 3 years. 3 years of this woman keeping a roof over our heads, paying for dinners, funding my business ideas, covering rent when things got tight. He chuckled. The room wasn't laughing as cleanly now. Something was shifting. "And I want to be real with y'all tonight. I want to be honest, because I think Nyla deserves honesty after everything she's given." She knew then. She knew before the next word came out. Her body understood it before her mind could construct the full sentence. The way you know a glass is going to fall before it leaves the edge of the table. "Nyla," Darius said, and now his voice had changed into something that wasn't cruelty exactly, but was something worse. Ease, like this cost him nothing, like she cost him nothing. "You are the most convenient woman I have ever met, and I want you to know, from the bottom of my heart, that I am grateful for everything you paid for everything you covered, because it gave me exactly the time I needed to find what I actually wanted." The quiet on that rooftop was the loudest thing Nyla had ever heard. "I would genuinely rather die," Darius continued, his voice bright and almost cheerful, like a man making a toast at a wedding, "than make you my wife. Not because you're not a good person, but because I have a type, and baby, you're not it." He reached out his hand then, and from somewhere in the crowd, a woman emerged. Nyla recognized her. She would not forget the recognition. It arrived like a physical impact, the way your body receives bad news before your mind catches up. Minjung Park, 27, flawless, her colleague in the executive support department, the woman who had borrowed Nyla's umbrella 3 weeks ago and never returned it. Minjung took Darius's hand and stood beside him with the particular posture of someone who had been waiting for this moment and found it worth the wait. "This," Darius said simply, "is my upgrade." Someone in the crowd laughed. It might have been nervous laughter. It didn't matter. It was laughter, and it filled the space that had been Nyla's dignity, and it echoed off the Seoul skyline and the white lights and the ivory tablecloths, and Nyla stood in the middle of it all and did not move. She set her glass down on the nearest table. She was precise about it. She did not slam it, did not let her hand tremble, did not give anyone the satisfaction of watching her shatter. She found her clutch on the chair where she'd been sitting. She retrieved her phone. She put the strap over her wrist with the careful, deliberate movements of a woman who understood that every action she took in the next 60 seconds would be the thing people remembered. And then she walked. Not toward the exit in a hurry, not with her head down. She walked the way she had trained herself to walk into every room that had ever made her feel like she didn't belong. Spine straight, chin level, eyes forward, each step placed with the kind of quiet intention that said, I am not running because there is nothing here worth running from. She did not look at Darius. She did not look at Minjung. She did not look at the crowd that had gone from laughing to something more complicated. Guilt, maybe, or the particular discomfort of people who had just watched something they couldn't unsee. She was nearly at the elevator bank when she heard it. Not Darius's voice, but another one, quiet, male, close enough that it wasn't meant for the crowd. Ms. Brooks. She stopped. Jung Si-won was standing 3 feet from the elevator doors, hands in his trouser pockets, and he was looking at her with an expression she had spent 2 years trying to read and mostly failed. He was 41, built with the kind of understated authority that didn't need a room to acknowledge it before it filled the space, and he had a face that gave away exactly what he chose to give away and nothing more. Tonight, for the first time, she couldn't identify what he was giving away. Sir? She said, because she was professional even when her chest felt like it had been excavated. The elevator takes 40 seconds from this floor, he said. If you'd like to leave without being followed, I'd suggest pressing the button now. She stared at him for 1 beat. Then she reached out and pressed the button. They stood in silence until the doors opened. She stepped inside. He did not follow her, but just before the doors closed, he said something she would not stop thinking about for the rest of the night. He's been planning that for months, Jung Si-won said quietly. And so have I. The doors closed. Nyla stood alone in the elevator as it descended, the city lights blurring past the glass panel, and she finally let herself breathe, one long, ragged exhale that she had been holding since the microphone feedback cut through the music and changed the shape of her life. She pressed her back against the elevator wall and closed her eyes and allowed herself exactly 30 seconds of the full weight of what had just happened. 30 seconds. Then she straightened. Then she put her phone in her clutch and looked at her reflection in the elevator's mirrored wall and said nothing. Because there was nothing to say yet. There was only the next step, and the one after that, and the quiet, burning question of what Jung Si-won had meant by the last 8 words he had spoken to her. He's been planning that for months, and so have I. The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened. The night air of Seoul hit her face when she walked through the front doors, warm and indifferent and enormous, and Nyla Brooks stepped into it with the last intact piece of herself she had left. The part that knew, even now, even here, that whatever came next was going to require everything she had. She had no idea how right she was. Her apartment was a 30-minute taxi ride from Kang Tower, and she spent it with her forehead against the cold glass of the window, watching the city slide past in streaks of color. She didn't cry in the taxi either. The driver had his radio on low, some late-night talk show, a man and a woman debating something she couldn't track. And she let the sound fill the space around her without trying to make sense of it. What she was doing instead was cataloging. It was a habit she'd developed young, from her mother, who used to say that when everything is on fire, the only useful thing to do is count what you still have. So Nyla counted. She had her job. She had her savings. Or at least she believed she did, and she would check in the morning. She had her apartment. She had her name. She had walked out of that rooftop with her dignity and her composure, and those were not small things. Those were, in fact, the most important things. What she no longer had was 3 years of her life, and the particular quiet devastation of realizing that the story she had been telling herself about her relationship had a different ending than the one she'd believed she was in. The taxi stopped. She paid. She took the elevator to the 14th floor of her building and stood outside the door to her apartment for a long moment before she put the key in the lock. Inside was worse than outside. Inside had his coffee mug on the counter. Inside had his jacket draped over the chair he always used. Inside had the specific smell of his cologne still in the air from when he'd gotten dressed this evening, standing in her bathroom, using her mirror, preparing himself for the performance she had not known was coming. She picked up the jacket. She walked to the front door. She opened it and hung the jacket on the exterior door handle because she was not ready to touch a trash bag yet, and she needed it out of her hands. Then she went to the kitchen and made tea, because her mother had also taught her that the body still needs tending even when the heart is in pieces. And she sat at the counter with both hands wrapped around the mug and let herself think. He's been planning that for months. She kept returning to it. Not to Darius. She had less interest in his planning than she would have expected, a numbness where the anger should have been building. But to Jung Si-won, the way he had said it, the precision of it, not, "I'm sorry that happened," or "that was awful." The things people said when they witnessed something ugly and didn't know what to do with it. He had said something specific, deliberate, the words of a man who had information and had chosen exactly when to release it. And so have I. She set her mug down. She thought about her CEO, the 2 years she had spent in his orbit, managing his correspondence, coordinating his travel, sitting outside his office and learning the rhythm of his decisions. He was not a warm man. He was not a cold one either. He was something more complex than either of those categories, and she had spent considerable mental energy over 2 years trying to find the accurate word for it. Present, maybe. He was entirely, unnervingly present in whatever space he occupied. He listened in a way most executives did not, with his full attention, not just enough attention to respond, and he had a memory for detail that she had initially found professionally useful and occasionally, privately, unsettling. He remembered things, small things, the way she took her coffee, the deadlines she flagged as high priority before they appeared on his calendar, the one afternoon she had left work 20 minutes early because she was sick, and the tea and medication that had appeared on her desk the following morning without a note, without any acknowledgement, as if it hadn't happened at all. She had told herself it was efficient management. She had told herself it was professionalism. She had told herself a lot of things over 2 years that she now, sitting in her quiet kitchen at midnight with a mug going cold, was not entirely sure she believed. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Then something, the particular instinct of a woman who had just been told the night wasn't finished yet, made her pick up. "Ms. Brooks." His voice was the same as it had been on the rooftop, measured, clear, as if calling someone at midnight was a perfectly ordinary thing and he'd simply chosen to be thoughtful about it. "I apologize for the hour. I wouldn't call unless it was necessary." "Mr. Jung," she kept her voice level. "It's late." "It is," he agreed as if the fact were interesting. "I need you to come in tomorrow morning, not at your usual time, earlier if you're willing, 7 o'clock. She thought about saying no. She thought about saying that her personal life had just detonated in front of her entire office, and she might need a day. Then she thought about the way he had said those 8 words, and the door they had opened in her mind, and she said, 7 is fine. A pause. Brief. The kind of pause that meant he had something else to say, and was choosing how. Nyla. Her first name. He had used it maybe 4 times in 2 years. What happened tonight was not random. I need you to know that before tomorrow, so you're not walking in unprepared. Her hand tightened on the phone. "How bad is it?" she asked. Another pause. This one longer, and in it, she heard the answer before he gave it. "Bad enough," Jung Si-won said quietly, "that I'm calling you at midnight." The line went still. She held the phone against her ear for a moment after he'd hung up, listening to the silence of her apartment, the distant sound of the city outside her windows, and the specific dawning horror of a woman who had just understood that the public humiliation she had survived tonight was not the worst thing that had been done to her. It was just the only part she'd been allowed to see. She didn't sleep. Not really. She lay on top of the covers still in her dress because pulling it off felt like admitting the night was over, and she wasn't ready to do that yet. Wasn't ready to close the chapter on what had happened and open the one that came next. The ceiling of her bedroom was the same off-white it had always been. The city outside made its usual sounds. At some point around 2 in the morning, a siren passed below and faded, and the silence that replaced it was so complete she could hear her own heartbeat. She lay there and thought about money, not about Darius, not about Minjung's hand sliding into his under 100 sets of eyes. Those images existed, they were real, they would cost her something eventually. But right now, in the dark, what her mind kept returning to was the specific and practical terror of her bank account. Because Jung Si-won had said what happened tonight was not random. He had said it was bad enough to call her at midnight, and the only category of bad that registered at that hour, For a woman who lived alone and paid her own way and had exactly one financial safety net was the category that involved her savings. She reached for her phone at 3:47 in the morning and opened her banking app and looked at the number and lay very still for a very long time. It wasn't gone. Not entirely. But it was wrong. The balance was wrong in a way that didn't announce itself immediately. It required the kind of attention that comes from knowing your own account, the way you know your own handwriting, the intimacy of someone who checks it every Thursday morning and knows the rhythm of its movement. There were withdrawals she didn't recognize, not large individually, careful, almost gentle in their increments. 300 here, 500 there. A transfer 2 weeks ago that she had a vague memory of authorizing, but couldn't recall the specific conversation around. Another one last month for an amount that was inside the range where her brain had filed it under unremarkable. Added together, they were not unremarkable. Added together, they were 4 months of careful, patient, systematic theft. She put the phone face down on the mattress and stared at the ceiling and breathed through her nose the way she had learned to breathe when her body wanted to do something louder than she was going to allow it. In, out, count it, hold it. She was a woman who had survived a father who left and a mother who stayed and a city that didn't care either way. And she was not going to come apart in her own bedroom at 3:47 in the morning over a man who had never deserved the access she had given him. But her hands were shaking. She noted that with the clinical distance she was forcing on herself. Her hands were shaking and her jaw was tight, and the dress she was still wearing felt like something she needed to get off her body immediately. She got up. She took off the dress. She hung it in the closet because she was not the kind of woman who left things on the floor, even now, even tonight. She put on a t-shirt and a pair of sweatpants, and she went to the kitchen, and she did not make tea this time. She poured 2 fingers of the bourbon she kept in the back cabinet for bad nights, and she sat at the counter and she drank it slowly, and she thought about what 7 o'clock was going to bring her. She was at Kang Tower at 6:43. The building was different before the city fully woke up. The lobby had the hollow, echoing quality of space not yet populated. The security desk staffed by a single guard who recognized her and nodded her through without making her sign in. The elevator to the executive floor was all glass and moved without sound, and she rode it with her arms crossed and her jaw set, and her eyes fixed on the rising skyline outside the glass. Seoul assembling itself in the gray-pink light of early morning like a painting being completed from the outside in. Young Si-won was already there. She hadn't expected that exactly, but she hadn't not expected it either. He was at his desk when she knocked on the open door of his office, jacket on, tie straight, a man who had either not gone to sleep or had slept in the brief, efficient way of someone who had long ago made peace with the idea that rest was a resource to be managed. There were 3 folders on his desk and a laptop open and a cup of coffee going cold at his elbow. He looked up when she'd knocked. He looked at her face, not her eyes exactly, but her whole face, the way a doctor looks at a patient, reading what isn't being said. And whatever he found there made him stand up. "Sit down," he said. Not unkindly, the way you say it when you're about to tell someone something that requires them to have both feet on the ground. She sat. She put her bag on the chair beside her. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at him and waited, because she was done performing ease she didn't feel. "I need to tell you some things," he said, "and I need you to hear all of them before you respond. Can you do that?" "I've been doing that for 2 years," she said. "I'm good at it." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, an acknowledgement. He sat back down and opened the first folder. "Darius Cole has been making withdrawals from your joint savings account since February," he said. "The account you opened together 18 months ago for what you described as a shared emergency fund. The total removed is $31,400 US equivalent." The number sat in the air between them. She had done the math at 3:47 in the morning, and she had gotten close, but not that close. Hearing it spoken aloud in a lit office in someone else's voice made it real in a way that the dark and the bourbon hadn't quite managed. "Okay," she said. Young Si-won looked at her. "Okay? Keep going." He watched her for a moment with that unreadable quality she had spent 2 years cataloging. Then he continued. "He has also been in contact with a property lawyer since March. Not to buy something, to transfer something." He turned the folder toward her. "Your apartment, Nyla. The lease is in both your names. You added him 8 months ago, I believe, because he told you it would make renewing easier." He paused. He had a document prepared to transfer full ownership to his name, citing financial contribution, which is fraudulent. The transfer was scheduled to be filed next Friday. She stared at the document. It had her signature on it, or something close enough to her signature that she would have needed to look twice under different circumstances. Under these circumstances, she saw immediately that it was not her handwriting. The angle was wrong. The pressure was wrong. It was close, but it was a copy made by someone who had studied the original and missed the specific hesitation she put into the B. "He forged my signature," she said. "Yes." "On a property transfer." "Yes." She put both hands flat on the desk. Not in anger. She needed the surface. She needed something solid under her palms. "When did you find out about this?" Young Suwon did not look away. 6 weeks ago. The room changed, not physically, but the air in it shifted, and what had been a conversation about Darius became something else. Something with a different shape, a different set of edges. 6 weeks, she repeated. "I became aware of unusual financial activity connected to your name through a routine security sweep. Our executives' close contacts are periodically screened for fraud indicators because—" He stopped, chose his words with the care of a man who understood this was a narrow path. "Because it has happened before, to other employees. And I have a standing protocol." 6 weeks ago, she said again, and her voice was flatter now. "You knew that the man I was living with was stealing from me, and you didn't tell me. I was building a case." His voice was steady, not defensive, certain in the way of someone who had already had this argument with himself and come out the other side. "If I had told you 6 weeks ago, you would have confronted him. He would have accelerated the transfer, and we would have had nothing actionable. The document would have gone through before we could prove it was fraudulent. You would have lost the apartment. Instead, I lost the last 3 years of my life in front of everyone I work with." He didn't flinch. "Yes, I didn't anticipate him making last night public. That was not part of what I was tracking." "What were you tracking?" "The money, the property documents, and Minjung Park." He opened the second folder. "She has been an active participant since the beginning. She introduced Cole to the property lawyer. She is the one who coached him on your signature. She had access to documents you'd signed in the shared drive system because you trusted her with your login on 2 occasions when you were traveling with me. The specific weight of that? Minjung. The umbrella. The lunches they'd shared in the break room. The small complaints about difficult calendar requests. The performance of collegiality that Nyla now understood had been something entirely different, landed somewhere behind her sternum and sat there like something swallowed wrong. She used my login, Nyla said, 3 times. We have the access records. And she's still employed here. She was, Jung Siwon said, as of yesterday. As of this morning, that is no longer the case. HR was notified at 6 a.m. She will not have building access when she arrives. Nyla looked at him. At the precise architecture of his face, the controlled stillness of a man who had been moving pieces on a board she hadn't known existed. And she felt, underneath the anger, underneath the shock, underneath the particular rawness of a woman who had just been told the scope of what had been done to her, something more complicated, something that didn't have a clean name. "You should have told me," she said. "Yes," he said. Simply. No qualification. She blinked. She had expected an argument. "That's it? Just yes?" "You deserved to know earlier. I made a judgment call that prioritized the legal outcome over your right to the information. I was wrong about the weight of that." He met her eyes directly. "I'm not going to pretend otherwise." The apology, if that was what it was, bare and spare as it came, disarmed her more than a fuller one would have. She looked down at the folders. She looked at her forged signature. She looked at the withdrawal records, the neat column of dates and amounts that mapped the slow, careful dismantling of everything she had built. "What happens now?" she asked. "That depends on what you want to happen," he said. "I have a lawyer. The documents are ready. We can file today if you want to move. The fraud charges are strong, so the forged signature alone is a felony, and the financial withdrawals without consent add to it considerably. His work visa is connected to his employment status, and his employer—" He paused. "He's been misrepresenting his position for months. His actual employment ended in March. He's been living on what he took from you." She absorbed that. March. He'd lost his job in March, and hadn't told her, and had simply continued, showing up, sleeping in her bed, eating at her table, wearing the face of a man with a life, while quietly taking hers apart piece by piece. "He's been unemployed for 4 months," she said. "Yes." "And I've been paying for everything." "Yes." She stood up. She needed to move. She walked to the window and looked out at Seoul filling up with morning, and she pressed one hand against the glass and felt how cold it was, and she breathed. "File it," she said. "All of it. Today. There's one more thing." His voice behind her was careful in a way it hadn't been before. She turned. He had the third folder open now. He didn't push it toward her. He held it with both hands and looked at it for a moment, the way people look at things they have been deciding whether to show. "This isn't about the fraud," he said. "You don't have to look at this today if you don't want to. It can wait." "Show me." He turned the folder. Inside was a printed email chain. She crossed the room and looked at it, and the first line she read was enough to understand what she was looking at. It was Darius and Minjung. Messages going back 11 months. Not about money, not about the apartment transfer. Those were practical, and this was something else. This was the language of two people who had been building something together for nearly a year, who had used the time Nyla provided them to construct an entire parallel life, who had laughed. She could see it in the tone, in the casual ease of the messages, at her specific and detailed generosity. There was one message, dated 4 months ago, that she read twice. Then she closed the folder. "Okay," she said. "Nyla, I said okay." Her voice didn't break. She was proud of that later. In the moment, she was simply focused on the next breath and then the next one. "Call your lawyer, file everything, and I need you to understand something." He waited. "I'm going to come to work every day," she said, "and I'm going to do my job, and I'm not going to fall apart in this building, but I need you to not look at me like I'm broken. I need everyone in this office to not do that. Because if I have to manage other people's discomfort about what was done to me on top of what was actually done to me, I will lose my mind." Jung Si-won looked at her for a moment with that quality she had never quite named. Then he said, "I look at you the same way I have always looked at you." She didn't know what to do with that sentence. She filed it in the place she was building for things that required examination later, when she had more bandwidth, when the ground had stopped moving. She went to her desk. She sat down. She turned on her computer. She pulled up his calendar for the day and began working through it with the specific and deliberate focus of a woman who had decided that work was the only stable surface available to her, and she was going to stand on it until the shaking stopped. Darius texted her at 9:12. She saw the notification, locked her phone screen, and put it face down in her drawer. At 10:30, a man she didn't recognize. Suit, briefcase, the particular purposeful walk of someone on a timed errand, arrived at the reception desk and was escorted directly to Jung Si-won's office. He was inside for 40 minutes. When he left, he was carrying 2 of the 3 folders. At 11:47, she got a call from her bank. She stepped away from her desk and took it in the small conference room down the hall, and when she came back, she sat down and stared at her screen for 30 seconds before she could focus on it again. The joint account had been frozen pending fraud investigation. Darius would not be able to touch another dollar. The bank's fraud department, alerted by documentation that had clearly been prepared with some care and delivered that morning, was treating it as a priority case. She thought about the look on his face when he discovered that. The specific moment when Darius Cole, who had spent 4 months living on stolen money and 11 months building a new life at her expense, would reach for his phone and find his access gone. She thought about what that moment would feel like for him, and she felt nothing about it. No satisfaction, no grief. A clean, windswept nothing where the feeling should have been. The way a field looks after a fire, scorched and bare, and somehow more itself than before. She was typing an email at 2:15 when Minjung Park appeared at the edge of her peripheral vision, and her body knew before her brain had processed it. Shoulders tightening, spine going rigid, that animal awareness of a threat locating itself in space. Minjung had apparently arrived at the building, found her access card declined, and escalated to the point where she had been let in by a manager who hadn't received the memo in time. She was standing in the corridor 15 feet away, and her face was a specific and ugly combination of fear and anger that Nyla recognized as the face of someone who has just understood that the thing they thought was secret is no longer secret. Their eyes met. Nyla did not look away. Minjung crossed the space between them in 10 steps, fast and close, And when she stopped at Nyla's desk, she was breathing hard, and her voice, when it came out, was pitched low and sharp. "What did you do?" Not a question, an accusation. Nyla set down her pen. She swiveled her chair to face the woman directly. She took one slow breath and she said, with complete and devastating calm, "Everything I should have done the moment I found out who you were. You have no idea what you've—" Minjung stopped, recalibrated. The fear was winning over the anger now, reshaping her face into something younger and less controlled. "This is not what it looks like. Darius told me you two were basically done. He said the relationship had been over for—" "Don't." Nyla's voice was quiet, not gentle. The kind of quiet that is its own kind of loud. "Don't stand in front of me and explain your choices using his words. You went into my files. You used my login. You helped him forge my name on a document that would have taken my home." She paused. "I don't want your explanation. I want you to understand that it didn't work." Minjung's face went through several things quickly. "You should go," Nyla said. "Security is going to ask you to leave in about 45 seconds, and it'll be cleaner for both of us if you're already moving." As if the sentence itself had summoned them, two security personnel appeared at the end of the corridor and began walking toward the desk with the specific unhurried authority of people who know the situation is already resolved and are simply completing the paperwork of it. Minjung looked at them, looked back at Nyla, and in her face, underneath the fear, underneath the recalculation, underneath everything that was practical and self-preserving, there was something that might, in another version of events, have been shame. She left without another word. Nyla turned back to her computer. Her hands were completely still. She noted that with the same clinical attention she had been applying to her own body since last night, cataloging, measuring, checking for damage. Her hands were still. Her breathing was even. The storm that had hit her in the space of 18 hours had been extraordinary in its scope, and she was still standing in the middle of it, and her hands were completely, entirely still. She was reading through a contract amendment at 4:58 when Jung Si-won came out of his office, stopped beside her desk, and said, without preamble, "It's filed, all of it. His bank accounts are frozen as of an hour ago. The property transfer has been formally rejected and flagged. The fraud investigation is open." "And his job?" she asked, because she had been wondering and hadn't let herself ask. "He told his employer he was a senior accounts manager at Kang Industries," Jung Si-won said. "He has been using that fabricated position as a reference point for 2 years," he paused. "His employer was informed this afternoon." She let the silence settle. Then she said, "He has nowhere to go." "No," Jung Si-won agreed. "He doesn't." She thought about Darius waking up that morning, waking up wherever he'd gone after the rooftop, probably Minjung's apartment, probably with the ease of a man who had set something in motion and was waiting for it to finish. She thought about the specific sequential moment when he would discover that his bank account was frozen, that his reference was invalidated, that the apartment transfer had been killed, that Minjung had been let go, that every door he'd left open had been quietly and methodically shut from the other side. She thought about what a man like Darius would do when he realized there was no version of this that ended in his favor. And she thought about the fact that a man like Darius, cornered and out of options, would not simply disappear. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. Not Darius this time. An unknown number, but not the same unknown number as last night. A different area code. A single text message that contained no greeting and no signature and just 8 words that made the temperature in her chest drop 15 degrees. "You want a war? You have no idea." She stared at the message for a long moment. Then she looked up and found Jung Si-won still standing beside her desk, watching her with that particular attention of his, and she turned the phone so he could read the screen. He read it. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did. Something that sharpened and settled in a way she had not seen before. And for the first time in 2 years of working beside this man, Nyla Brooks understood that the controlled, deliberate CEO she had believed she knew completely was only the surface of something considerably more formidable than he had ever allowed her to see. "Don't respond," he said. "I wasn't going to." He looked at the message for another second. Then he took out his own phone and made a call, turning slightly away from her desk. And when the line connected, he spoke in Korean, quiet and fast. And she caught only one phrase she was certain of. Not because her Korean was strong enough for legal nuance, but because she had heard him use it once before, 18 months ago, in a meeting that had ended the career of a board member who had made the mistake of underestimating him. Jutnai Sibsio. Finish it. He hung up. He put his phone in his pocket. He looked at her. Go home, he said. Lock your door. And Nyla. He paused on her name the way he always did, like it was a decision. Don't be alone tonight if you can help it. She picked up her bag. She stood. She was almost to the elevator when it struck her. The full, unignorable weight of what was happening, not just to her, but around her. The scale of what had been set in motion by one man's greed and another man's quiet, patient, 2-year-long decision to watch over her without telling her he was doing it. She pressed the elevator button. The doors opened. She stepped inside. And it was in that exact moment, standing in the glass elevator as it began its descent, with soul spreading out below her in the gathering dark, that her phone buzzed again. Not a text this time. A call. Darius. His name on the screen like an accusation, like a dare, like a man who had just found every exit locked and had decided that the only move he had left was to come directly at her. She watched the phone ring, once, twice. The elevator kept moving. The city kept assembling below her, indifferent and enormous and full of the next thing that was coming, whatever shape it took. On the 4th ring, she declined the call, dropped the phone in her bag, and looked at her own reflection in the mirrored elevator wall. A woman at the precise, irreversible moment when the person you used to be and the person you were about to become stood in the same body and agreed, for the first time, on exactly what needed to happen next. She didn't go home. That was the first decision. Small, instinctive, the kind made in the body before the mind has finished its argument. She rode the elevator down to the lobby and walked through the front doors of Kang Tower and stood on the sidewalk in the cooling evening air with her bag over her shoulder and Darius's declined call still sitting in her phone like an unexploded thing. And she knew with the certainty of someone who had been paying attention to their own survival instincts for 31 years that going home tonight meant sitting in 4 walls that still held the shape of a life she no longer lived. And she was not ready to do that. She called Priya instead. I saw what happened last night, Priya said, before Nyla had finished the first sentence. Her voice was the voice of a woman who had been waiting for this call and had strong opinions about what it deserved. I've been sitting on my hands all day trying to decide if I should reach out or give you space. Tell me which one you need. Neither, Nyla said. I need food, and I need someone who isn't going to look at me like I'm a tragedy. I have japchae and 0 sympathy, Priya said. Get in a cab. She ate at Priya's kitchen table and let the noise of someone else's apartment, the television on low in the other room, the particular domestic percussion of a person who actually cooked, wash over her without trying to process it. Priya asked one direct question. How bad is the financial damage? And when Nyla gave her the number, Priya said, that absolute parasite, with a specificity of contempt that was more comforting than any expression of pity would have been. And then she refilled Nyla's glass and they talked about other things, ordinary things, the kind of conversation that exists to remind a person that the world is still mostly made of ordinary things, even when your specific corner of it is on fire. She slept on Priya's couch. Not well, but she slept. In the morning, she went back to her apartment before work and stood in the living room and looked at it the way you look at a place you are deciding whether to keep. She had taken his jacket off the door handle, so someone had, or it had fallen, and it was on the floor of the hallway, and she stepped over it without picking it up because she was done touching things that belonged to him. The coffee mug was still on the counter. She put it in a bag with the 3 other items in the apartment that were demonstrably his, and she set the bag outside the door and locked it. She was at her desk by 7:15. Young Suwon arrived at 7:40 and stopped at her desk in that way he had, not hovering, not checking on her, just pausing in the specific way of someone acknowledging without making an event of it, and said, the lawyers filed the 2nd set of documents this morning. The property fraud is now part of the criminal complaint. Good, she said. He nodded once and went into his office, and that was the entirety of it, and it was exactly right. The morning moved the way mornings do when you are holding yourself together through the structure of work, call by call, email by email, the reassuring machinery of a job that needed doing regardless of what was happening in your personal life. She managed 3 scheduling conflicts, drafted responses to 2 executive correspondence items, coordinated a last-minute venue change for a board meeting, and did all of it with the focused precision that had made her indispensable over 2 years. The precision she had built not because she was naturally organized, but because she had learned early that competence was the most reliable form of armor available to a woman in a room that wasn't designed with her in mind. It was 11:23 when her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. Different from the threat text, different area code entirely. And something made her answer it. "Is this Nyla Brooks?" A woman's voice. Professional, neutral, with the specific careful flatness of someone trained to deliver information without editorial. "It is. My name is Detective Han Soo-yeon. I'm with the Seoul Metropolitan Police Financial Crimes Unit. I was hoping you could come in this afternoon for a conversation. We've opened a preliminary inquiry based on documentation submitted to us this morning, and we have a few questions for you." Nyla's hand tightened on the phone. "What kind of questions?" "Standard questions for the victim in a fraud complaint." A pause that was almost too brief to notice. "And 1 or 2 questions about the complaint itself." "What does that mean?" "It would be easier to discuss in person, Ms. Brooks. Would 2 o'clock work?" It worked. She told Jung Si-won where she was going, and he offered his lawyer without hesitation, and she said she didn't need a lawyer for a victim's interview. And he said, with that precise, understated way he had of making a point without pressing it, "Take the lawyer's card anyway." She took the card. The Financial Crimes Unit was on the 4th floor of a building 40 minutes across the city, a room that smelled like recycled air and old coffee, and had the particular low-level aggression of fluorescent lighting. Detective Han was a compact woman in her late 30s with short hair and eyes that did the same thing Jung Si-won's did, taking in everything and releasing only what was intentional. She shook Nyla's hand once, firm and brief, and directed her to a chair across a table that had a recording device on it and a folder that was conspicuously closed. "Thank you for coming," Detective Han said, and it was a professional courtesy, not warmth. "You said you had questions about the complaint itself," Nyla said. She was not going to wait for the setup. She had not slept properly in 2 nights, and she had limited patience for architecture. "What does that mean?" Detective Han opened the folder. She turned it so Nyla could see the first page. "Do you recognize this document?" It was a wire transfer authorization. Nyla's name on it, her signature, or the same practiced forgery that had appeared on the property transfer documents. The amount was significant. The destination account was one she did not recognize. "That's not my signature," Nyla said. "We believe that," Detective Han said. "However, this document was submitted 3 days ago as part of a separate legal filing, not the fraud complaint your CEO's law firm filed, but a different one, filed by a third party claiming to represent Darius Cole." She paused. "The claim being made is that you authorized a significant financial arrangement with Mr. Cole 18 months ago, that you reneged on that arrangement, and that the withdrawals from your joint account were legally authorized repayments of a debt you owed him." Nyla heard the words individually and then waited for them to assemble into something that made sense. They didn't make sense. She went through them again. "He's claiming," she said slowly, "that I owe him money. He's claiming you entered into a financial agreement, that the terms were verbal but witnessed, and that he has documentation of your acknowledgement of the debt." Detective Han slid another page across the table. "This is a signed statement from a witness claiming to have been present when the agreement was made." Nyla looked at the name on the witness statement, Park Min-jung. The room did one slow revolution around her and then stopped. "She signed a witness statement," Nyla said. "After being terminated for cause this morning, after her own involvement in the fraud has been documented, she signed a witness statement for him." "The statement was signed 4 days ago," Detective Han said. "Before the termination. 4 days ago. Before the rooftop. Before the gala." While Nyla had been at her desk managing calendars and drafting correspondence, and believing that the worst thing happening in her life was a relationship that had gone quietly cold, Darius and Min-jung had been filing counter-documentation. They had anticipated the fraud complaint. They had prepared for it. They had built a structure designed to muddy the legal water so thoroughly that any investigation would take months to untangle. And in those months, she stopped the thought, finished it properly. In those months, he would have had time to move money she didn't know about, time to establish the property transfer through a different channel, time to do whatever the next step of the plan was The step she and Jung Si-won had not known to look for because they had believed the plan they'd found was the whole plan. It wasn't the whole plan. Ms. Brooks, Detective Han said, watching her with that careful professional neutrality. I want to be clear about something. The documentation your CEO's law firm submitted this morning is strong. The forgery on the property transfer is evident, the withdrawal pattern is consistent with fraud, and the access records from your company's system corroborate unauthorized use of your credentials. She paused. But this counterfiling creates a complication that we have to work through until we can establish the witness statement is fabricated. And with a signed document that requires either a recantation or independent contradicting evidence, there is a procedural hold on certain elements of the fraud complaint. What does that mean practically? It means the account freeze on Darius Cole's personal accounts is currently being contested in a separate filing, and we have 72 hours to present evidence to maintain it, or it lifts automatically. Detective Han folded her hands on the table. He has a lawyer, Ms. Brooks. A very good one. The kind that requires significant money to retain, which raises its own questions, but that is a separate thread. Nyla stared at the table. She thought about 4 days ago. She thought about Darius getting dressed in her bathroom, asking her if the burgundy dress made her look like royalty, and she thought about the fact that at the exact same moment he had been doing that, the counterfiling had already been prepared and sitting somewhere, waiting to be deployed. She thought about the text message. You want a war? You have no idea. He had known, even then. He had known before the gala. The rooftop performance had not been impulsive. It had been a signal, a starting gun, fired the moment he had confirmed that his backup documents were in place and he was ready to run. Who's the lawyer? She asked. Detective Han hesitated. The hesitation itself was information. That's not information I can share at this. The lawyer is someone I know, Nyla said. Not a question. Detective Han's face did not move, but she did not contradict it. Nyla sat with that for 5 seconds. 10. She made herself breathe through the specific and particular rage of someone who has just understood the full geometry of what was done to them. Not just the theft, not just the public humiliation, not just the forged signatures and the manipulated savings and the 11 months of parallel betrayal, but the layered, premeditated, load-bearing architecture of a plan that had been designed to survive discovery. That had accounted for the possibility of being caught and had built an exit around it. She had not been a victim of impulse. She had been the target of something that required months of sustained, deliberate intelligence. And somewhere in that understanding, underneath the rage and the horror and the specific cold grief of it, was something else. Something smaller and harder and more useful. She called Jung Si-won from the lobby of the police building. He picked up on the second ring. She told him what Detective Han had said in 4 sentences, flat and direct, no editorializing. There was a silence on the other end that was not shock. He was not a man who expressed shock audibly, but was something she had learned to read as the silence of a person recalibrating quickly. The witness statement is the problem, he said. Yes. If Minjung signed it 4 days ago, she was still employed. She had building access. She could have been... He stopped. I need to make a call. Don't go back to the office yet. Find somewhere to sit. I'm not going to fall apart in a coffee shop waiting for you to fix this. I know that, he said, without a beat of condescension in it. I need 20 minutes, and I need you somewhere I can reach you. That's all. She found a cafe across the street. She ordered coffee she didn't drink and sat at a table by the window and watched the street with the focused, deliberate attention of someone who needed to look at something external. Because looking inward right now produced a quality of anger she could not afford to spend before she knew where to aim it. He called back in 14 minutes, 14 times. The lawyer representing Cole, Jung Si-won said, is Kim Jung-hyun. He is very good and very expensive, and he doesn't take cases he doesn't believe he can win. A pause. He also represented the board member we removed 18 months ago. I don't think that's a coincidence. The board member. Nyla pulled the memory up. The meeting, the Korean phrase, "Gutnesipsyo," the man who had been quietly and efficiently excised from Kong Industries' board after what Jung Si-won had described to her simply as a conflict of interest requiring resolution. She had not known the details. She had not needed them. She had typed the meeting notes, filed the correspondence, and moved on. Tell me the details now, she said. The ones you didn't tell me 18 months ago. A silence. longer this time. His name is Baek Seong-min, Jung Si-won said. He was on the board for 6 years. When I had him removed, he made it known that he considered it a personal matter. He has been peripheral since then, present enough that I've been aware of him, not active enough that I had grounds to do anything further. You think he found Darius? I think someone introduced Darius Cole to a woman in my executive support department, helped him understand the access she could provide, and funded a legal strategy sophisticated enough to anticipate a fraud complaint. His voice was careful and precise, and entirely without the quality of a man surprised by what he was saying. That requires resources and motivation that a man like Darius Cole does not have independently. She pressed her free hand flat against the table. The cafe was warm. The coffee in front of her had stopped steaming. Outside, Seoul moved past the window with its usual magnificent indifference. This isn't about me, she said. No, he said. Not originally. You were... He stopped. Say it. You were access, he said, to me, to my schedule, my correspondence, my building. Someone needed someone close to me who could be compromised, and you were... He stopped again, and this time she understood that the stop was not about choosing words. It was about something the words cost him. You were chosen because you trusted people, because you were generous and decent, and you extended that to someone who looked for exactly those qualities in a target. She sat with that for a moment. The full, terrible shape of it. She had not been humiliated because she was naive. She had been selected because she was good. What do we do about the 72 hours, she said. I'm working on it. His voice shifted back to the operational register she knew better. The access records from the system, the ones that show Minjung used your login. Those directly contradict the witness statement's implied premise. If she was accessing documents through your credentials without your knowledge, she cannot simultaneously be a reliable witness to a voluntary financial agreement you made. That's the thread we pull. He paused. But I need something from you. What? I need you to think very carefully about every conversation you had with Darius in the last 18 months that was witnessed by anyone at all. A dinner where someone at another table knew you, a phone call you took in front of a colleague, any moment where someone else was present for a financial discussion between the two of you. She thought. She pushed past the anger and the exhaustion and the specific heaviness of a person who has not slept properly in 2 days, and she thought, and then she remembered something. Priya, she said. What? Priya was there. She sat forward. 8 months ago. The night I added Darius to my lease, he made a comment. I remember because it irritated me even then. He said something about how he'd been helping with the finances and it was only fair his name was on the paperwork. And I told him that wasn't how it worked, that he hadn't contributed to the lease fund, that he was on the lease as a formality of shared residence, not as a financial partner. She was speaking quickly now, the memory sharpening with the pressure of its own relevance. And Priya was sitting right there. She had come over for dinner. She heard the whole thing. Ma'am. The silence on the line had a different quality now. That directly contradicts the premise of a voluntary debt acknowledgement, Jung Si-won said quietly. I told him explicitly in front of a witness that he had not contributed financially. That's the opposite of acknowledging a debt. I'm calling the lawyer, he said. Right now. Nyla. The pause on her name, that specific, deliberate pause. This is going to be all right. She almost said something sharp back. She was tired of people telling her things would be all right. Tired of the phrase's hollow promise, the way it asked her to perform a faith in outcomes she hadn't been shown yet. But she stopped herself, because the man saying it had spent 6 weeks building a legal case to protect her before she knew she needed protecting. And that was not the behavior of someone making empty promises. Call the lawyer, she said instead. She went back to the office. She sat at her desk. At 4 o'clock, Priya appeared at her desk with the specific expression of a woman who has just been contacted by a legal team and has something important to say. And she sat down in the visitor's chair and said, without preamble, They called me. I already told them yes. I remember that dinner. I remember exactly what you said to him. I remember because I thought at the time it was a strange thing for him to even try. She paused. I will say it in writing, under oath, in front of whoever needs to hear it. Priya, don't thank me. He tried to use your apartment against you. I don't have a lot of patience for men who do that. At 5:47, Jung Si-won's lawyer called her directly. The witness statement had a critical problem. Not just the access records contradicting Min Jung's credibility, but something the lawyer had found in the filing itself. The statement had been notarized with a stamp that the notary office had flagged as potentially duplicated from an earlier filing. It was being investigated for authenticity. The 72-hour procedural hold on the account freeze was being challenged on those grounds, and the challenge was strong. She hung up and sat very still at her desk. The plan that had been built to survive discovery was beginning to show its seams. She was gathering her things at 6:15 when the email came, not to her personal account, to her work account, from an address she didn't recognize, a long anonymous string of letters and numbers that told her nothing about its origin. The subject line was blank. The body of the email contained 4 words and an attachment. Look at this first. She should not have opened the attachment. She knew that. She would know it for a long time after, the specific knowledge of a person who made a choice in the wrong direction because the alternative was not knowing, and not knowing had already cost her more than she could count. She opened it. It was a photograph, time-stamped 11 months ago, taken, based on the angle, from outside a restaurant window. Long lens, steady hand, the work of someone who had been paid to document something specific. The restaurant was one she recognized. She had been there. She and Darius had celebrated their 2-year anniversary at that restaurant, 11 months ago, at a table by the window. In the photograph, Darius was at the table, but he was not sitting across from Nyla. He had arrived early. She could see the timestamp, 30 minutes before she would have been there, and he was sitting with 2 other people, a man she did not know, and a woman. The woman was facing partially away from the camera, but there was enough of her profile visible, and the quality of the long lens was sharp enough that Nyla could see what she needed to see. The woman was Kim Sua, 63 years old, member of the Kang Industries Board of Directors for 9 years. The only board member who had consistently, quietly opposed Jung Si-won's expansion strategy for the past 3 years. A woman Nyla had managed correspondence for, scheduled meetings with, greeted by name at 14 different company events. A woman she had believed, without any particular evidence, was on her side. Nyla looked at the photograph for a long time. She looked at the timestamp. She looked at Darius's posture, relaxed, familiar, the posture of a man in a meeting with people he had met before, not strangers. She looked at the third person at the table, the man she didn't know, and she looked at his hands and at the object on the table in front of him, which was a folder, and at the pen in his hand, and at the particular lean of his body that said he was not a guest at the dinner, but the conductor of it. Her phone buzzed. The anonymous email address had sent a second message. She's been funding it from the beginning. Not Bake? Her. The board vote next month. Jung loses his position if this works. You were never the target. You were the weapon. She read it twice, 3 times. Then she looked up from her phone and across the office and through the glass wall of Jung Si-won's office, where he was on a phone call, standing at his window with his back to her, looking out at the city with the posture of a man who was used to fighting and had not yet been told that the front he was defending was not the front being attacked. She had 48 hours before a board vote that she now understood was the actual destination of everything that had been done to her. And the man whose career was on the line did not know the full truth of what was coming. And the woman who had just learned it was sitting at her desk with a photograph on her screen and the particular terrible clarity of someone who has just understood that the ground they thought they were standing on is not ground at all. She stood up. She picked up her bag. She walked to the glass door of his office and she knocked once. And when he turned from the window and saw her face, he ended the call without saying goodbye, because whatever he read in her expression told him that what she was holding was not something that could wait. She opened the door. She sat down across from him. She turned her phone screen to face him, and she said, with the flat, stripped-down voice of someone who had passed through shock and come out the other side into something colder and more functional, "We've been looking at the wrong person, and we have less time than you think." He looked at the photograph for 11 seconds. She counted. Not because she was detached. She was the opposite of detached, every nerve in her body firing at a frequency that made the fluorescent light above his desk feel like it was vibrating, but because counting was the only thing that kept her from filling the silence with something she couldn't take back. 11 seconds. Then he set the phone down on his desk, face up, and he looked at her. Kim Sua, he said. Yes? You're certain that's her? I managed her calendar for 2 years. I know her profile from 30 yards in bad lighting. Nyla leaned forward. The man with them. The one with the folder. Do you know him? Young Siwon looked at the photograph again. Something moved in his face. Not surprise, but the specific recalibration of a man fitting a new piece into a structure he thought he already understood. His name is Ryu Chun-ho. He's a corporate strategist. He works with boards, specifically with boards that are preparing to make leadership changes. The words landed with the weight of something finally named. She's been building a case to remove you, Nyla said. She's been building a case for 3 years, he said quietly. I knew she opposed the expansion strategy. I knew she had relationships with 2 other board members who have been difficult. I did not know she had moved from opposition to active removal. He stood. He walked to the window, his back to her, his hands at his sides, and she watched the line of his shoulders and the stillness of a man absorbing something that required the body's full cooperation to process. The board vote is in 48 hours. I know. If she has 3 votes secured and can present evidence of... He stopped, turned. Evidence of misconduct or instability or a scandal significant enough to justify an emergency confidence review. His eyes found hers. Darius on that rooftop. The fraud complaint generating a counterclaim. My executive assistant embroiled in a criminal investigation. A CEO whose personal circle has become a liability, she said. Yes, she stood up. She couldn't sit still anymore. The shape of it was too large. The architecture of what Kim Sua had built too deliberate, and sitting down felt like accepting something she was not ready to accept. She paced to the window and back and said, she needed the scandal public before the vote. That's why the rooftop. That's why the timing. Darius wasn't just ending things. He was creating a news cycle. Your executive assistant, public humiliation, fraud counterclaims. Any one of those is manageable. All 3 at once, 48 hours before confidence vote. It's designed to look like my house is on fire, he said. And you didn't know about the fire because you were too busy watching the smoke. They stood across from each other in the glass-walled office, with Seoul going dark outside and the weight of 48 hours pressing down on the room like something physical. And for the first time since Nyla had walked into this building 2 years ago, she saw something in Young Soo-won's face that she had never seen before. Not fear. Not quite. But the closest thing to it that a man like him was capable of. The particular tension of someone who has just understood that the fight they are in is not the fight they prepared for. I need to call an emergency board session, he said. If you call it before she does, you control the agenda, Nyla said. But you need the evidence in hand before you walk into that room. The photograph alone isn't enough. It's 2 people having dinner. You need the funding chain. You need to show the money that paid for Darius's lawyer came from somewhere connected to her. That takes time we don't have. Then we start now. She picked up her phone. I'm calling Priya. She has contacts in the legal department who have been doing financial background work on the counterclaim. If the money trail for Cole's lawyer connects back to any account or entity associated with Kim Sua, they will have touched it in the last 72 hours. She was already dialing. You call your lawyer, tell him what we know. Tell him we need the funding source for Kim Jong-hyun's retainer by morning. He was already reaching for his own phone. They worked through the night. Not together, exactly. He was in his office, she was at her desk, and the glass wall between them was lit against the dark of the empty floor like 2 separate fires burning in the same building. But the work was shared, the direction unified, and there was something in the parallel intensity of it. The silence broken only by phone calls and the occasional crossing of the floor when one of them had something the other needed to see. That felt like the truest version of a partnership Nyla had ever been inside of. Priya came back to the office at 9:47 with a laptop bag over her shoulder and the expression of a woman who had made a decision about what side she was on and found the decision uncomplicated. She sat at the desk beside Nyla's and opened her laptop and said, "Tell me exactly what we're looking for." And Nyla told her, and she started looking. At 11:15, the lawyer called Young Si-won with the first thread. Kim Jong-hyun, Darius's high-end legal representation, had been retained through a corporate intermediary, a small consulting firm registered in Busan, whose operating history was thin and whose primary client relationships, when examined, trace back through two holding entities to a private investment vehicle associated with a name they had not expected. Not Kim Sua directly. Ryu Chano, the strategist with the folder. He's the conduit, Nyla said, standing in the doorway of Young Si-won's office with the lawyer's call still live on speaker between them. She doesn't touch it herself. She uses him. The money goes from her private investment to his consulting firm to Cole's lawyer. It's 3 steps removed. 3 steps is documentable, the lawyer said from the phone. It will take until morning, but it's documentable. We need it before 9 a.m., Young Si-won said. I'm calling the board chair at 7 to request an emergency session for 10. A pause on the line. I'll have it. She went back to her desk. She drank cold coffee and worked and did not think about the fact that she had not slept in approximately 40 hours because thinking about it would make it real, and she needed it to not be real for approximately 7 more hours. Priya fell asleep in her chair at 1 in the morning, and Nyla put her own jacket over her shoulders and kept working. At 2:44 in the morning, her phone rang. Darius. She looked at the screen for 3 full rings. Then she answered because she was done declining and done waiting and done giving him the power of her non-response. Nyla. His voice was different from the rooftop, different from the texts, stripped of the performance, the ease, the practiced charm. What was underneath was something rawer and less controlled. I need you to listen to me. I'm listening, she said. Her voice was flat. This is bigger than both of us. What's happening? The legal stuff, the board thing. I didn't know it would go this far. I thought it was just... He stopped, recalibrated. She could hear him breathing, the particular pattern of a man choosing how much truth to spend. I need you to drop the complaint. She said nothing. Nyla, if this goes to a full criminal investigation, things come out that I'll lose my visa, I'll be deported, everything I've... His voice cracked, not with grief, with the specific desperation of someone whose options have collapsed to a single point. I know what I did was wrong, I know that, but I'm asking you as someone who... We had 3 years. We had 3 real years. Does that count for nothing? She looked at the glass wall of Young Si-won's office, at the man inside it, on the phone, building the case that would end this. She looked at the Seoul skyline beyond him, the city that didn't care and never had. 3 years, she said. You want to talk about 3 years? She kept her voice even. You were meeting with Ryu Chun-ho 11 months ago. So let's count the real years, Darius. How much of those 3 was actually real, and how much was job performance? A silence that told her everything she needed. Drop the complaint, he said. Quieter now. The crack in his voice had smoothed over into something harder. Or I swear to you, what comes out next will be worse than what you've already seen. She ended the call. She turned her phone over. She went back to work. At 4:17 in the morning, Priya woke up with her head at a painful angle and said, I found something. And Nyla was at her side before the sentence finished. It was a calendar entry, pulled from a metadata trail in a document that had been uploaded to the company's shared compliance drive 8 weeks ago by Kim Sua's office. A filing that should have been routine, a standard pre-vote disclosure document, but which had been generated from a template whose properties still carried the original author's name in the metadata. Not Kim Sua, not her assistant, Ryu Chun-ho. He had written the disclosure document that Kim Sua filed under her own name 8 weeks ago as part of her board preparation. And embedded in the template metadata, in the document's revision history, was a version note that included a date reference, a meeting date, flagged for content review, that matched the timestamp on the photograph. He was writing her board documents while simultaneously managing the operation against Young Si-won, Priya said. That's not just a financial connection, that's direct operational coordination. Can we authenticate it? The metadata is inherent to the file. It doesn't require authentication. It's part of the document's own record. Nyla straightened up. She looked at the clock. 4:21 in the morning. She walked to Young Si-won's office and knocked and went in and put Priya's laptop on his desk and pointed. He leaned forward. He read. He was quiet for 30 seconds. Then he picked up his phone and called the lawyer and said, Add this to the morning package and call the board chair's emergency line. Tell him I need 5 minutes before 7. He put the phone down. He looked at Nyla across the desk. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The office was quiet in the particular way of a place in the dead center of the night, and outside the windows the city was at its lowest ebb, not sleeping exactly, but breathing slowly, a few lights scattered in the dark, the Han River a black ribbon in the distance. "You should try to sleep," he said. "So should you. I don't need—" "Neither do I." He looked at her. That look, the one she had spent 2 years failing to fully name, the one that was not professional and not impersonal and not anything she had been able to file neatly into the categories she maintained for people in her life. He looked at her with it, and she looked back, and the silence between them had a quality it hadn't had before, something that had been building for a long time in a space neither of them had acknowledged directly. She went back to her desk. She did not sleep. At 6:53, Kim Jung-hyun, Darius's lawyer, arrived at the building. She saw him in the lobby on the security feed she had pulled up on her secondary monitor, a habit of 2 years of executive coordination. He was early, which meant he knew the board session was being called, which meant Darius or Kim Sua had told him, which meant they were moving to preempt. She called down to security. "The man in the lobby, Kim Jung-hyun, he doesn't have a meeting scheduled in this building today. Please ask him to wait while you verify." "Yes, Ms. Brooks." She picked up her phone and texted Jung Soo-won. "His lawyer is in the lobby. They know about the session." His response came in 4 seconds. "Good. Let him wait." At 7:15, Jung Soo-won walked out of his office in a fresh shirt. She didn't know when he'd changed. She hadn't seen it happen. The man was a ghost when he needed to be, with the complete composure of someone who had made a decision in the night and was now simply executing it. He stopped at her desk. "The board chair confirmed the emergency session at 10, he said. "The package from the lawyer arrives at 8:30. I need you in that meeting." She looked up. "I'm not a board member." "You're the person who found the evidence," he said. "And you are the person this operation was built around. The board needs to see that." He paused. "Can you manage it?" She thought about 40 hours without sleep, about the dress she'd worn to the gala still in her closet, about Darius's voice at 2:44 in the morning cracking at the edges. She thought about Kim Sua sitting across from her at 14 company events with a pleasant professional expression and a plan running underneath it. She thought about what it meant to walk into a boardroom and be looked at as both the evidence and the witness. "Yes," she said. At 8:45, the lawyer arrived with a package that contained the funding chain documentation, the metadata evidence from the compliance document, the access records from the company system, Priya's signed statement, and a financial forensics summary that laid out, in 17 pages, the complete operational map of what had been done and who had authorized it. Nyla read all 17 pages, standing at her desk in 40 minutes. At 9:30, Kim Sua arrived at the building. Nyla watched her on the security feed. A composed woman in her 60s in a gray suit, moving through the lobby with the particular authority of someone who believed the day was going to go her way. She had 2 people with her. One was Ryu Chanho. She texted Jung Si-won. "She's here. Chanho is with her." His response, "I know. Conference room A is ready. 10 o'clock. She stood up. She straightened her jacket. She picked up the 17-page document and her notebook and her phone, and she walked to the elevator, and she did not let herself think about what she looked like, or what the board members would see when they looked at her, or whether the 40 hours without sleep showed in her face. None of that was relevant. The only relevant thing was the package under her arm, and the truth inside it, and the next 90 minutes. The boardroom on the 32nd floor was a room she had been in dozens of times, setting up for meetings, adjusting presentation systems, ensuring the room was exactly right before the important people arrived. She had always left before the meeting started. She had always been the person who prepared the space and then disappeared from it. She walked in and sat down and did not disappear. There were 9 board members. 7 were present in person, 2 on screen. Kim Sua took her seat at the far end of the table with the deliberate placement of someone claiming territory, and when her eyes found Nyla across the table's length, something moved in them. A flicker, brief and quickly suppressed, of a woman recalculating. Jung Soo-won came in last. He sat at the head of the table, and he did not look at Kim Sua, and he did not look at Nyla, and he did not do anything that could be read as performance. He opened the session the way he opened everything. Directly, without preamble, with the complete authority of a man who understood that how you begin a room determines everything that follows. "Thank you for coming on short notice," he said. "I'll be brief. There is a matter of board integrity that requires immediate attention, and I have documentation sufficient to address it thoroughly. I'm going to present it now, and I ask that questions be held until the presentation is complete." Kim Sua said, "I'd like to note for the record that this emergency session was called without the standard 48-hour. You'll have the floor shortly," Young Siwon said. Not unkindly. Precisely. The way a surgeon says, "Hold still." "I ask for 15 minutes first." A beat. The board chair, a man named Oh Young-soo, who had been in the position for 11 years and had the specific patience of someone who had seen enough to wait for things to fully reveal themselves, said, "Proceed." Young Siwon nodded. He opened the package. He began. He was methodical, not emotional. He laid the funding chain first, the three-step money trail from the private investment vehicle to Ryu Chan-ho's consulting firm to Kim Jong-hyun's retainer, and he did it with the flat documentary precision of someone presenting a financial audit. Then he laid the metadata evidence, explained its significance in 2 sentences, and passed copies around the table. Then he presented the operational timeline, the 11-month photograph, the access record violations, the forged documents, the coordinated filing of the counterclaim, and he showed how each element connected to the next with the patience of a man who understood that the truth was most powerful when it was allowed to build without theatrics. Nyla watched the board members' faces. She watched the 2 on screen. She watched the specific sequential moment when each of them understood what they were looking at. Not a CEO defending himself, but a man presenting evidence of a coordinated attack on corporate governance that had used a human being as its primary instrument. She watched Kim Sua's face most carefully. At the beginning of the presentation, Kim Sua's expression was the controlled, pleasantly skeptical face of a board member hearing a colleague's position. At the 3rd page of the funding chain documentation, something shifted. So small that if Nyla hadn't been watching for it, she would have missed it. The particular stillness of someone who has just understood that something they believed was hidden is no longer hidden, who is now computing very quickly how much has been found and how much remains, and whether there is any version of the next 15 minutes that ends in their favor. The computation took approximately 90 seconds. Then Kim Sua's face went very smooth and very still, and Nyla recognized that particular stillness from somewhere unexpected. She recognized it from her own face in the elevator mirror on the night of the rooftop, the specific composure of a person who has decided that whatever comes next, they will not be seen to break. Young Siwon finished the presentation. He set down the final page. He said, "I'll take questions now." The first question came from a board member named Park Ji-hoon, who had been on the board for 4 years and had a reputation for asking the question everyone else was thinking. He looked at Kim Sua and he said simply, "Do you have a response to the documentation presented?" Kim Sua looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked at Jung Si-won. Then she looked, and this was the part Nyla would remember long after everything else had faded, directly at Nyla. And her face, in that look, was not defiant and not apologetic and not calculating. It was something Nyla had not expected from a woman who had spent 3 years building an elaborate machine to dismantle someone else's life. It was something that looked stripped of everything strategic, almost like exhaustion. Then Kim Sua said, "I'd like to request a brief recess to consult with legal counsel." "Counsel is not permitted in closed board sessions," the chair said. "I understand." She folded her hands. "Then I have no statement at this time." The room understood what that meant. Nyla understood what it meant. The absence of denial from a woman who had never been without a position in 11 years of board meetings was its own statement, complete and unambiguous. The chair looked at Young Siwon. He looked at the board. He said, "I'd like to call a vote on an immediate suspension pending full investigation. All in favor?" At that precise moment, the boardroom door opened, not because someone had knocked, not because a meeting had been requested. The door opened because Darius Cole had apparently convinced the building's security, with what combination of persuasion or deception she would learn later, that he had an urgent document delivery for the board session, and he had walked himself up 32 floors and through the door before anyone had stopped him. He looked wrong. That was the first thing she registered. Not just unshaven, not just the rumpled clothes of a man who had not slept. He looked like someone whose internal structure had begun to fail, the specific quality of disintegration that happens when every plan a person has made stops working simultaneously and the body starts to carry the weight of it. His eyes found Nyla first, then Jung Si-won, then the table full of board members staring at him. "I have information," he said. His voice was not steady. "About this company. About him." He pointed at Jung Si-won. "And I will go to every media outlet in this city if you don't hear me out." The room was absolutely silent. Jung Si-won looked at Darius with the expression of a man who has already read the last page of the book and is watching someone else try to find the ending. He said nothing. He simply waited, with the particular patience of someone who understood that the next words out of this man's mouth were going to be the last move on a board that had already been decided. Darius reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder and held it up and said, "She authorized every withdrawal. I have proof. I have texts. I have—" His hand was shaking. She could see it from across the room, the fine tremor of someone burning through the last of their reserves. "I'm not going to be the only one who goes down for this. If I go, she goes. If I go, Mr. Cole." The chair's voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. "You have entered a closed board session without authorization. Security has been called. Whatever you're holding, you may present it to the proper legal channels, which I believe already have your complete attention." A pause. "Please step back from the table." Darius looked at the folder in his hand. He looked at Nyla. And in his face, she saw something she had not expected to feel anything about seeing. Something that was the ruin of a person who had made too many calculations and not enough good choices and had arrived at the end of his own story without a version of it that worked. She felt nothing. Not pity, not satisfaction. A clean, absolute nothing. She was done. Two security personnel entered. Darius looked at them. He looked at the room one more time, a last survey of something he had lost the right to any part of, and then he lowered the folder and let them escort him out, and the door closed behind him, and the room breathed. The chair said, "The vote. 7 in favor, 0 opposed. 2 abstentions." The 2 board members on screen, who would later be found to have been aware of Kim Sua's position and had chosen, in the final moment, not to commit. Kim Sua was suspended from the board pending full investigation, effective immediately. Jung Si-won sat at the head of the table and received the result with the same controlled stillness he had brought into the room, and Nyla watched him from across the table and felt the specific, enormous release of 48 hours of forward motion arriving at its destination. The room began to move, board members standing, conversations starting, the practical machinery of what came next assembling itself. He looked at her across the table, just for a moment, and in that moment he let her see something he did not show the room, not triumph, not relief, something quieter and more personal than either of those. Something that arrived in his face the way it had in those 8 words in the elevator that first night, and demanded to be examined later when the ground had stopped moving. She held it. She filed it in the place she had been building for exactly that kind of thing. She was standing in the corridor outside the boardroom, phone in hand, beginning the process of notifying the lawyer when she felt the specific awareness of someone standing close behind her and turned to find Jung Si-won 6 inches away with his jacket over one arm and his sleeves rolled to the elbow, and the particular look of a man who has been deciding whether to say something for a long time and has decided. "Nyla," he said. She waited. "What was done to you," he said, "was done because someone understood that you mattered enough to be useful. That your position, your competence, your proximity to me, all of it had weight." He paused. "I want you to know that I have understood that weight for longer than any of this." She looked at him, at the face she had spent 2 years reading and never quite finished, at the man who had called her at midnight and filed documents at dawn and built a case for 6 weeks before she knew she needed one, at the person who had looked at her on a rooftop when she had nothing left and said the one thing designed not to comfort her, but to prepare her. "How long?" she asked. The answer he gave her was not in words. It was in the specific, quiet, unguarded way his face changed when he looked at her, the professional stillness releasing in the way of something that had been held for a very long time. And it was the most honest thing she had seen from him in 2 years of watching him carefully. Her phone rang. The lawyer. She looked at the screen. She looked at Young Si-won. She held up one finger. One moment, and she answered. And even as she raised the phone to her ear and turned her attention to the call, she felt the conversation that had just begun between them settle into the space where it would live until she was ready to finish it. Behind her, she heard him exhale. Just once. The sound of a man who had been holding something for a very long time and had finally been given permission to set it down. She kept her voice steady for the lawyer. She answered the questions. She confirmed the details. She did all of it with the precise, unshakable competence that had made her indispensable before any of this happened and would make her irreplaceable after. And in the glass wall beside her, she caught her own reflection. A woman at the center of something enormous, still standing, still steady, still entirely herself. And for the first time in 72 hours, she let herself think about what came next. Not what survived. Not what she had salvaged from the wreckage. What she was going to build from here, on ground that was finally, undeniably, her own. The lawyer was still talking. She listened. Her hand was completely still. Outside the window, Seoul was bright and indifferent and full of the next thing, and it was already beginning. The lawyer's call lasted 19 minutes. When it ended, Nyla stood in the corridor outside the boardroom and looked at the phone in her hand for a moment, the way you look at something that has just delivered the last piece of news you were waiting for. Not with relief, not with triumph, but with the particular stillness of a person whose body has been running on emergency fuel for 3 days and has just received the signal that the emergency is over. Darius Cole had been detained by building security and handed to the 2 officers from the Financial Crimes Unit who had been waiting in the lobby since 8:45 that morning. Detective Han's arrangement, coordinated with the lawyer overnight, timed to the board session's conclusion. His lawyer, Kim Jung-hyun, had arrived 20 minutes too late to prevent the detention and was now attempting to negotiate terms that his client's complete evidentiary exposure made extremely difficult to negotiate. His work visa status had been flagged by immigration, connected to the fraudulent employment claims he had made for 2 years. The joint account freeze had been made permanent pending criminal proceedings. The property transfer had been formally voided, and Nyla's name restored as sole leaseholder on record. She put her phone in her pocket. She straightened her jacket. She walked to the elevator and rode it down to her floor and sat at her desk and opened her email and began working through the morning's correspondence with the focused, deliberate efficiency of a woman who understood that the machinery of ordinary life did not pause for personal catastrophe, and found that fact, today, oddly comforting. She worked for 2 hours. Nobody on the floor said anything to her about what had happened in the boardroom. The news was moving through the building. She could feel it in the slight change of atmosphere, the way a room changes when something significant has shifted. But nobody approached her desk with questions or condolences or the particular brand of office sympathy that would have required her to manage someone else's feelings about her experience. She was grateful for that. She had spent enough energy on other people's comfort. At 1 in the afternoon, Priya appeared with 2 containers of soup from the place 3 blocks away that Nyla had been ordering from since her first week at Kang Industries, set one on the desk without a word, and sat down in the visitor's chair with the other. They ate in silence for a while. "He's being charged," Priya said eventually. Not a question. Fraud, forgery, visa violations. Nyla kept her eyes on the soup. The financial forensics report goes to the prosecutor's office this week. His lawyer is trying to negotiate a plea, but the documentation is thorough. And Minjung? Terminated with cause. The access record violations are part of the criminal complaint as conspiracy to commit fraud. She paused. She'll lose her professional certifications. The signed witness statement that turned out to be notarized with a fraudulent stamp is its own charge. Priya was quiet for a moment. And Kim Sua? Nyla looked up. Board investigation is underway. The funding chain connects her to the operation directly enough that the company's legal team is pursuing separate action for breach of fiduciary duty. She set down her spoon. She's done. Not just the board. Her career in Korean corporate governance is finished. Nobody will touch her after this. And Ryu Chanho, being interviewed by investigators as of this morning. Priya absorbed all of this. She ate a spoonful of soup. She looked at Nyla with the direct, uncomplicated honesty that had made her the right person to call on the worst night of the last several years, and she said, "How are you actually doing?" Nyla thought about it. She gave the question the genuine consideration it deserved instead of the reflexive answer she would have given a week ago. I don't know yet, she said. I think I've been in motion long enough that I haven't had time to feel the parts that are going to hurt later. They will, Priya said, simply, without apology. Not the Darius part. I don't think that's going to hurt as much as you think. The part where you understand how long it was happening before you knew, that one's going to take a while. Nyla picked up her spoon again. I know. You're allowed to take a while. I know that too. Priya finished her soup and left, and Nyla sat at her desk in the quiet of a building putting itself back together, and she let herself feel, for the first time in 72 hours, the actual texture of where she was. Not what had been done. Not what had been prevented. The specific weight of being a person who had been chosen as a weapon against someone she respected and had become instead the reason the weapon failed. There was something in that she couldn't name cleanly. It wasn't quite pride. It was something older and less comfortable than pride. The particular knowledge of what you are made of that only arrives after you have been put under enough pressure to find out. Jung Si-won came to her desk at 4:30. He didn't sit in the visitor's chair. He stood the way he usually stood when he had something brief and specific to say, but his hands were not in his pockets this time, and his posture had the quality she had seen in the boardroom corridor. Something released in it. Something that was no longer holding itself at the professional distance she had learned to read as default. The board has confirmed interim governance arrangements, he said. The investigation into Kim Sua's activities will be led by an external firm to ensure independence. Oh Young-soo will chair the oversight committee. He paused. It will take months, but the company's position is stable. Good, she said. He was quiet for a moment. She waited. I want to offer you a new role, he said. Not as my executive assistant. He held her gaze. Director of Executive Operations. You would oversee the entire executive support function, coordinate directly with the board chair's office, and have the authority and compensation that should have reflected your actual contribution for the past 2 years. He paused again, briefer this time. This is not pity, and it is not compensation for what happened. It's a correction of something that should have been addressed earlier. She looked at him. You're offering me a promotion the day after I've been awake for 50 hours. I'm offering it now because I should have offered it 8 months ago, and I don't want to wait any longer than I already have. She thought about it. Not the role. The role was right, and she knew it, and he knew she knew it. But the way he was standing at her desk saying it. The particular quality of a man who has spent a long time doing things from a careful distance and has decided, in the aftermath of something that stripped everything unnecessary away, that the distance is no longer serving its purpose. I'll take it, she said. Under one condition. What condition? No more 6-week silences when there's something I need to know. He looked at her for a moment with something in his face that she could finally, completely read. Agreed, he said. She nodded. He went back to his office. She turned back to her screen and finished her day. 3 weeks later, the criminal complaint against Darius Cole was formalized, and the prosecutor's office issued a public statement confirming charges of fraud, forgery, and criminal conspiracy in connection with the targeted financial exploitation of an identified victim. The statement named the victim only as a private individual, but in the environment of a corporate scandal that had already generated considerable coverage. A suspended board member, a terminated employee, a CEO's dramatic boardroom defense. The outline of the story was visible enough that nobody who worked at Kang Industries needed the name spelled out. Nyla read the statement on her phone during her lunch break, sitting at a table in the small park 2 blocks from the building where she had eaten lunch alone on the difficult days when the office felt too enclosed. The autumn had come while she wasn't paying attention to seasons, and the trees were doing what trees did regardless of what was happening underneath them. And the air had that particular Seoul October quality, cold and clean and carrying a smell that she had no name for in any language she spoke, but had come to associate, over 3 years of living in this city, with the feeling of a day that was about to turn. She thought about the last time she had sat in this park. 6 weeks ago, before the gala, before the microphone, before the 72 hours that had changed the geography of her life. She had eaten a sandwich and checked her email and thought about nothing in particular, and the ease of that, the unremarkable, undefended ease of a person who didn't yet know what was coming, felt very far away. She didn't want it back. That surprised her. She had expected grief for the uncomplicated version of herself that had existed before, the woman who trusted easily, and didn't know yet what that trust had cost her. But what she felt, sitting in the park with the autumn trees and the criminal complaint on her phone, was not grief. It was something closer to the feeling after a fever breaks. The specific, exhausted clarity of a body that has fought something and come through and is now, finally, simply itself again. More itself, maybe, than before. She finished her lunch. She went back to work. The hearing for Darius's initial plea took place on a Thursday in November, in a courthouse 40 minutes from Kang Tower. Nyla did not attend. She had provided her testimony in writing, reviewed by the lawyer, and had been told her physical presence was not required at this stage. She had considered going anyway, had considered looking at him in a formal setting one final time, giving the whole thing the witness it perhaps deserved, and had decided against it in the same quiet, certain way she had been making decisions since the night of the gala. Not because it would hurt her, because it would add nothing she needed. The lawyer called her afterward. Darius had entered a guilty plea on 2 of the 4 charges in exchange for reduced sentencing, with the fraud and forgery charges carrying the weight of the criminal record that would follow him. His visa was revoked. He would be deported within 60 days of sentencing. He would not be returning to Seoul. She thanked the lawyer. She hung up. She finished the quarterly report she had been working on and sent it to the board chair's office and made herself a cup of tea and stood at the window of her new office. Director of Executive Operations, a corner office on the 31st floor, 2 rooms smaller than Young Si-won's but with a view of the river that she had not yet stopped being surprised by. And she looked at Seoul in the November light and she said goodbye to something. Not to Darius specifically. To the 3 years. To the version of herself that had made the specific and particular errors of a woman who had confused devotion with worthiness, and had spent years offering everything she had to a man who had looked at everything she was and seen only what it could give him. She said goodbye to that woman with the gentleness that version of herself deserved. Not contempt, not impatience, not the harsh self-judgment she had been applying in the darkest hours of the past weeks. Just a hand on the shoulder, a steady look, and a door closing. She turned back to her desk. She had work to do. Minjung Park's professional certification appeal was denied in December. The forensic evidence from the company's access records was unambiguous enough that the appeal board's decision was, as the lawyer described it, not particularly close. She left Seoul in January. Where she went, Nyla did not know and did not look for. Kim Sua resigned formally from the board in late November, before the external investigation concluded, which the investigative firm described as consistent with an awareness that the investigation's findings would have led to formal removal. The breach of fiduciary duty action resulted in a settlement in March of the following year that was not publicly disclosed, but that the board chair, in a brief and carefully worded conversation with Nyla in a corridor one afternoon, described as sufficiently significant. Ryu Chunho's consulting firm was dissolved. He was named in civil proceedings. His subsequent career in corporate strategy did not recover. The things that happened to all of them were serious and they were real, and they were, in their various forms, the consequence of choices made over months and years with a full understanding of what those choices cost other people. Nyla thought about this sometimes. Not often, but sometimes, in the particular late-night hours when the mind goes to the places it has been avoiding. She did not think about it with satisfaction. She thought about it with the sober acknowledgement of someone who understood that the machinery of consequence is impersonal and thorough and does not require her emotional participation to function. What happened to them happened. She had her own life to build. The building was the part that mattered. She was good at the director role in ways she had not anticipated being good at, because the skills she had spent 2 years developing as an executive assistant, the ability to see across multiple priorities simultaneously, to read the needs of complex people before they articulated them, to manage the gap between what a room required and what it was currently providing, translated upward with a precision that surprised even her. She built a team. She restructured the executive support function in ways that eliminated 3 redundant processes and improved response time across the floor by a margin that generated, in February, a formal commendation from the board chair's office. She took the commendation and put it in her desk drawer and went back to work, because she had not chosen this career to collect endorsements. She had chosen it because she was good at it, and it was genuinely important, and she had decided, somewhere in the months after the gala, that the things she chose to do would be chosen on those grounds and no others. She and Jung Si-won navigated the new geography of their professional relationship with the careful, mutual attention of two people who understood that something had shifted and were choosing, deliberately, how to approach the shift. He was not a man who moved quickly toward personal things. She was not a woman who required that he be someone he wasn't. They worked together with the same precision and alignment as before, and underneath the work there was something that grew with the slowness of things that grow correctly, without forcing, without the false acceleration of people trying to outrun their own uncertainty. He asked her to dinner in March, not as a gesture of power or gratitude or pity, as a man asking a woman to dinner in the particular, slightly uncertain way of someone who has been thinking about the question for much longer than the asking of it suggests. He said, "There's a restaurant on the river I think you'd like, if you want to go sometime." She looked at him across her desk, across the 2 years and the 60 hours, and the boardroom and the park and the window of her corner office and everything that had been built and broken and rebuilt in between, and she said, "Saturday." They went on Saturday. The restaurant was what he had said it would be, quiet, good, with a view of the Han that turned the city into something almost abstract. They ate without performing ease they didn't feel, and talked without filling silence that didn't require filling, and she understood by the end of the evening that this was what it felt like to be in the presence of someone who had looked at exactly who she was, in the worst circumstances available, and had not once looked away. The months that followed were not uncomplicated. They were two people with demanding careers and significant histories, and the particular challenges of a relationship that had begun in the context of professional hierarchy and had to find its own new shape without that structure. There were conversations that required honesty of the uncomfortable kind. There were evenings when the weight of the previous year sat in the room between them and had to be acknowledged before it could be set down. There were moments when she pulled back, when the muscle memory of a woman who had been systematically deceived activated without her permission and produced a distance she hadn't intended and had to consciously choose to cross. She crossed it, every time. Not because it was easy, because she had made a decision, in the park in October with the criminal complaint on her phone, that the things done to her would shape her understanding of the world, but would not govern her behavior in it. That she would not spend the rest of her life conducting every relationship as a forensic investigation of past damage. That she would extend trust deliberately, with her eyes open, in full knowledge of what trust had cost her before, and that the deliberateness of it would be the difference. He was patient in a way that was not passive. He did not wait for her to come to him in the easy, expectant manner of a man who assumed arrival. He was present and specific, and consistently, quietly himself. And over time, the consistency became its own form of evidence. Not proof of perfection. He was not a perfect man. He was a particular man, with edges and habits and a difficulty with small talk that she had always found oddly endearing and now found simply familiar, but consistent, honest, present in the full, unguarded way that had distinguished him from every other person in the room that night on the rooftop when he had stood 3 feet from an elevator and told her the truth before she knew she needed it. They married on a Saturday in September, 14 months after the gala, in a ceremony that contained 12 people and no speeches, and a dinner afterward that lasted until past midnight because nobody wanted to leave. Priya gave a toast that was 3 sentences long and devastating in its accuracy. The board chair attended and was unexpectedly gracious about the wine. The river was visible from the restaurant terrace, and the city was lit in a way that made it look like something from a distance, something seen rather than survived. She wore a dress she had chosen herself, in a color that had nothing to do with any occasion before this one, a deep green that her mother, calling from Atlanta at 7 in the morning Seoul time, had said made her look like someone who knew exactly where she was going. Her mother had not been wrong. In the weeks after the wedding, when the life she had built had acquired the particular solidity of something witnessed and formalized and made permanent by the presence of the people who mattered, Nyla sat sometimes at the desk in her corner office on the 31st floor, and looked at the river and thought about the night on the rooftop, not with the quality of pain it had carried in the beginning, not with the clean nothing she had felt during the worst of it, with something she had no word for in any of the languages she operated in, a feeling that contained simultaneously the damage of what had happened and the fact that she was here. And the distance between those two things was the exact measure of everything she had done since. She had not been rescued. She needed that to be clear in her own accounting. needed it the way she needed the factual precision of a well-constructed report. She had been helped. There was a difference, and it mattered. The man she had married had provided resources and information and the particular kind of loyalty that does not announce itself. But she had walked out of the rooftop under her own power. She had sat in a police interview room and understood the scope of what she was facing and chosen to face it. She had made the calls, pulled the threads, stayed awake, read the 17 pages, walked into the boardroom and sat down and not disappeared. She had done that. It was hers. No version of the story that credited someone else with her survival was a version she was willing to accept. What she had been given was something different, rarer maybe, and worth more than rescue. She had been seen. Accurately, completely, without the distortions of pity or desire or the particular conditional vision of people who see you as a version of what they need you to be. She had been seen as she was, capable, flawed, generous to a fault, harder underneath than anyone had given her credit for, and worth, without qualification, without the caveat of what she looked like or where she came from or what the man on the rooftop had declared in front of 100 people, worth every bit of what she had built for herself. That scene had not made her, but it had confirmed something she had always suspected about herself and had spent years looking for someone honest enough to confirm. On a Tuesday in October, exactly a year after she had sat in the park and said goodbye to something she no longer needed, she submitted the first draft of a structural proposal to the board chair. A comprehensive reorganization of the executive operations function at Kang Industries that would, if approved, make the role she occupied the third most senior administrative position in the company's leadership structure. The proposal was 42 pages, thoroughly documented, and had taken her 6 weeks to build. She submitted it at 4:47 in the afternoon, and then closed her laptop and put on her coat and rode the elevator down to the lobby. Jung Si-won was waiting at the front desk, which was where they had agreed to meet, and he was looking at his phone and had the slightly distracted quality of a man who had been in back-to-back meetings since 8 in the morning and was now running on professional autopilot. She came through the lobby, and he looked up, and the distraction cleared from his face the way it always did when he saw her, completely, immediately, like a window clearing. And he said, "Ready?" "Yes," she said. They went out through the front doors of Kang Tower into the October evening, Seoul arranging itself in that particular October light she had come to love, the air that clean and particular smell she still had no name for, the city enormous and ongoing and entirely indifferent to any one person's story within it. She had made her peace with the indifference. The city did not owe her its attention. It had provided the setting, the rooftop, the elevator, the park, the boardroom, the river at night, and she had provided everything else. They walked toward the river in the cooling dark, two people moving at the pace of people who are not hurrying toward anything because where they are is already where they intended to be, and the city moved around them in all its noise and light and beautiful ordinary complexity. And Nyla Brooks, director, wife, daughter of a woman who had worked double shifts and taught her to count what she still had, walked through it with her shoulders level and her hands steady and the quiet, unshakable knowledge of someone who has been through the fire and come out the other side, not smaller but more precisely, irreducibly herself. The river was visible at the end of the block. The city was loud and lit and enormous. She kept walking,